We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair.
Soon after the confrontation in Birmingham, President Kennedy introduces sweeping new civil rights legislation. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders organize a march on the nation's capital to demonstrate their support and their strength.
250,000 people from all over the country, buses streaming in for days. It was an extraordinarily important event that put before the nation in very clear terms the choices that had to be made. And the way in which the marchers in Washington behaved, the peacefulness of the protest, the eloquence of the speakers gave both the people involved in the civil rights movement and Americans watching this on their screen the sense that the issue of racial equality was the most important issue facing the American people, and that action had to come quickly.
Just 3 months later, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. As president, Johnson applies both public and private pressure on the Senate to pass the stalled Civil Rights Bill. Early in 1964, he succeeds in getting the 2/3 majority necessary to stop the Southern filibuster.
Well, it's just not things we're used to down here. I mean, they come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us, because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
One of the things that's clear to me from studying history is that racism in the United States has been wide but not terribly deep. When you got a public accommodations section passed in the '64 Civil Rights Act and restaurants had to be integrated, it was astonishing to see how quickly those barriers fell. It's astounding how patterns that we think of as deeply held beliefs can evaporate almost in a minute if it becomes clear that there's an authority that's going to say, yes, you have to treat people equally.
During the summer of 1964, thousands of civil rights workers, black, white, northern and southern, spread throughout Mississippi and the South to work on behalf of black voter registration.
The act that really brought large numbers of blacks into the political process was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we're talking almost 100 years after the ratification of the 15th Amendment that guaranteed blacks the right to vote.
The 65 Act was passed basically on a bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where Martin Luther King Jr. led a group of local folk in Selma on a march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the fact that blacks in Alabama were disenfranchised. And it created a lot of national attention because the television stations cut away from the Sunday night movie Judgment at Nuremberg to play this war happening right here in the United States.
This mob scene at the bridge, is really shocking to most Americans outside the South and provides some very powerful popular support for the notion that we can't fool around any longer. We want a really tough voting rights guarantee, which involves sending federal registrars into every county and states that had a low black registration rate.
When the law was passed and finally signed by Johnson in August of 1965, there were only a handful of black people who were registered to vote in Dallas County, which is the county where Selma is located. And then within the next 3 or 4 months, 15,000 blacks were registered to vote because federal examiners were actually sent down to the South and were empowered to register people.
By the 1960s, the problem of racial injustice is no longer limited to the South or to rural areas. 69% of American blacks are now living in cities, often in embattled inner-city neighborhoods.
There's a kind of sense of abandonment in central city areas. There's growing poverty, crime, just very poor quality of life. And then you see explosions of anger among people that are left behind.
When the news of the Watts riot broke in the summer of 1965, Johnson was vacationing at the LBJ Ranch in Texas. It was just at the time he was putting into effect the whole Howard University affirmative action program of trying to create real, genuine opportunity for racial minorities, African Americans in particular. So the sense that the expectations that he had created had somehow led to this maelstrom was deeply troubling. And of course, more than anything else, that kind of tore apart the country and the coalition that he and Kennedy and Truman and FDR had worked so painstakingly to assemble.
Disillusioned, impatient, an increasing number of African Americans adopt a more militant approach. Black power.
Many people point to the origins of the idea of black power to a series of appearances and rallies going across Mississippi of Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, the young new leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1966, in which King was trying to lead the crowds in chants of freedom now, and Carmichael would follow with chants of black power.
You're going to sit in front of your television set and listen to LBJ tell you that violence never accomplishes anything, my fellow Americans. While he's storming the hell out of North Vietnam.
The black faction decides to kick the whites out altogether, saying, you know, it's very nice you helped us, but now we want to run our own show, and you should go work in white communities, which, after all, is where the problem of racism is.
And so they begin to develop an ideology not of integration, but of separation, not of American patriotism, but of black nationalism.
For instance, consider the Black Panther Party formed in Oakland, California in 1965 under the leadership of Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. It begins by kind of putting black cultural nationalism and Marxist-Leninist revolutionary thought together with the idea of kind of creating a revolution of freeing black America through struggle.
The great race riots of the 1960s. They didn't really have leaders, but there were kind of self-appointed spokesmen who stood up saying, this is black power in action.
In Detroit, an obscure black nationalist group, the Nation of Islam, gains prominence. The most celebrated black Muslim, as whites often refer to them, is Malcolm X.
Legislation and change the conditions that our people face in the South.
Blacks in the South had been so discriminated against, so segregated, that to break through those barriers was such a triumph that they didn't need anything else for a while. But if you'd been in Harlem, or you had been in Detroit or Chicago, segregation had crumbled long ago. For those people, the socioeconomic discrimination was much more important, and there weren't so many breakthroughs. And so there was a lot of appeal of more, quote, militant people to the North. What we see as a militants versus moderate split.
And this certainly terrified a lot of whites who thought, if this is black power in action, let's return to white power. So those two things together really mark an end to the civil rights movement, which had accomplished its main programmatic goals.
The civil rights movement ends legalized segregation, but it also awakens expectations of social and economic equality that laws alone cannot meet, and that in many respects, even today, remain unfulfilled.